Peter Mason had always believed in the dignity of honest work. At 58, he had spent over half of his life inside the humming walls of Dalton Engineering, a manufacturing company in northern Ohio known for building heavy-duty equipment. He joined the company in the mid-90s when it was still run by the Dalton family, practical people who understood machines and the people who made them run. Peter started as a floor technician, working long shifts in oily coveralls, and over the decades earned his way to technical director. He wasn't the loudest in the room or the most politically savvy, but he was the one others turned to when something broke, when a deadline loomed, or when new hires needed to understand not just how things were done, but why. The company changed hands in late autumn. Dalton Engineering was quietly sold to a private investment firm based out of Chicago, a group more fluent in spreadsheets than steel. Within weeks, Harvey Langford, a man with a polished MBA and no trace of shop floor experience, was appointed as CEO. His smile was smooth, his shoes shined, and his words lacked weight. To some, he represented modern efficiency. To others, he brought the chill of something colder, something less human. It didn't take long for the changes to begin. Long-standing relationships were replaced with policy briefings. Quality assurance was seen as an overhead expense. Meetings grew tense. Rumors of restructuring passed like nervous glances in the break room. And then, one Tuesday morning, Peter received an Outlook invitation titled Strategic Transition Meeting. The sender was someone he had never spoken to directly. The conference room was sterile. Glass walls, chrome chairs, the Dalton family portrait gone. A junior HR representative read from a printed sheet. The language was clean, professional, and merciless. Peter was being let go as part of a strategic restructuring aimed at streamlining legacy leadership roles. His presence was valued and his contributions historic, but the decision was final. He was given a folder with severance paperwork and a company-branded pen he didn't take. It was quick, efficient, painless in appearance. But Peter's walk back to his office was heavy. He passed by cubicles he had helped design, saw machines he had once rebuilt by hand. No one said much. Everyone had learned to be quiet under the new regime. He packed slowly, methodically. Framed photos, some notebooks, a mechanical pencil set from 2003. He didn't look back when he left. Outside, the sky was low and gray, matching the concrete parking lot where his truck waited. Peter didn't drive home right away. He sat behind the wheel, hands resting still, and stared at the main building. It wasn't anger he felt, not exactly. It was more like something had been unplugged inside him, an engine winding down. That night, long after dinner, he climbed into the attic. He hadn't been up there in years. Dust covered everything. In the far corner sat a weathered toolbox and a faded cardboard container labeled prototypes. He dragged it down, opened the lid, and began leafing through hand-drawn diagrams, component sketches, and margin notes in his younger handwriting. Ideas he never had time to develop, designs he believed in. He stayed up past midnight, surrounded by pages and silence. Peter didn't know what he would build yet, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't finished. 3 weeks after the layoff, Peter Mason officially registered his new business under the name Keystone Fabrication. It was more a symbol than a company at first, just a name on a document, a promise to himself. The building that housed it was an old truck repair shop on the outskirts of Toledo, long abandoned and partially gutted. Its concrete floor cracked, its roof patched with mismatched tin. But to Peter, it was enough. It had space, light, and the quiet needed to think. He worked alone in the beginning. Days bled into nights as he reconfigured the dusty space into a functional workshop. He brought in secondhand equipment, lathes, welders, a small CNC machine, bought cheap from a retired machinist. His focus was narrow and deliberate. Compact welding modules designed for small farms, repair shops, and independent contractors. Machines that were simple, durable, and modular. Tools that didn't pretend to be more than they were. He knew there was a market for that, a gap left open by manufacturers too busy chasing sleek designs and cost-cutting margins. Peter's days became a rhythm of quiet labor. Mornings began with coffee brewed on a hot plate beside a rolling toolbox. He drafted schematics by hand, ran tests, calibrated outputs, and documented everything with the precision that had once defined his role at Dalton. There was no committee, no quarterly target, just the slow, steady process of building something from scratch. Then, one by one, the old team began to return. Danny Cruz, the former lead technician at Dalton, stopped by after hearing about Peter's new venture. He hadn't found steady work since his layoff and missed the feel of real machinery. He joined without asking for a salary. Then came Marcia Lynn, a meticulous quality control inspector whose standards had often clashed with the new Dalton leadership. She arrived with a clipboard and a quiet smile. A week later, June Perkins, the accountant who had managed budgets and payrolls for nearly 2 decades, offered to set up the books. All of them shared the same story. Dismissed coldly, dismissed quickly, dismissed because someone at Dalton believed numbers mattered more than knowledge. Peter couldn't pay much. Every dollar counted. But what he could offer was honesty. He showed the books. Everyone knew where the company stood. There were no false promises, no inflated projections. What they earned, they reinvested. Tools, repairs, raw materials. They kept overhead low. They didn't waste a cent. Marketing was word of mouth. Instead of glossy ads, Peter and Danny took the prototype modules to regional trade fairs. They set up small booths next to livestock feed suppliers and tractor parts dealers. Farmers stopped by, asked questions, tested the controls. Some placed orders, small ones, but steady. Each contract was a lesson. Each delivery refined the next version. They listened, adjusted, iterated. A feedback loop built not on focus groups, but on real people doing real work. Keystone's reputation grew, not fast but solid. It became known among rural mechanics and local welders as the company that didn't overpromise and didn't disappear after the sale. When something broke, Peter himself answered the call. Meanwhile, cracks began to show back at Dalton Engineering. The cost-cutting measures introduced by Harvey Langford started to erode the foundation. Quality control had been dissolved, its processes replaced by vague efficiency protocols. Materials were now sourced from low-bid international suppliers, including thin-gauge steel from China that warped under heat. Safety training was reduced to a single online module, optional for part-time workers. Over the next 6 months, Dalton lost 3 major clients, all of them citing defective parts or late deliveries. 2 mid-level managers resigned. A safety incident involving a hydraulic press left a worker hospitalized, prompting an investigation by the State Labor Board. Rumors of liability suits circulated. Employee morale dipped into silence. Peter didn't celebrate. He watched from afar, focused instead on the next version of the welding module, on the next delivery, on keeping the shop running. Keystone wasn't thriving yet, but it was real, and it was his. 8 months after its modest beginning, Keystone Fabrication won a competitive bid to supply equipment to a community college in Michigan. It was their first large-scale contract, a real breakthrough. The order included 20 customized welding modules and support systems, along with a year-long service agreement. For Peter and his team, it was validation. Their work, their standards, and their persistence had been recognized not only by small businesses, but by an institution that had reviewed dozens of competing proposals. But success came with visibility. The announcement of the award triggered waves beyond their workshop. At Dalton Engineering, the news landed on the desk of CEO Harvey Langford. The name Keystone, until then a footnote in local trade circles, now appeared alongside public procurement records. Intrigued, Harvey ordered a review. Within days, he learned that Peter Mason, the man his company had dismissed without ceremony, was leading this new venture. What began as curiosity turned into irritation, and soon after, legal counsel was engaged. Dalton's lawyers sent out formal inquiries, alleging potential breaches of contract, possible misuse of proprietary knowledge, and intellectual property violations. They combed through Keystone's product literature and marketing material, searching for any evidence of infringement. But Keystone had built everything from the ground up. Its systems were original, its components distinct, and Peter had maintained thorough documentation of their development process. There were no secrets stolen, no blueprints reused. The legal effort dissolved without filing a suit. Peter understood what this meant. Keystone was no longer invisible. It had become a name worth noticing and challenging. Still, he refused to be pulled into a fight he didn't need. Instead of reacting with public statements or counterclaims, He directed his energy inward. The team, galvanized by the scrutiny, poured themselves into refining their next innovation. They developed a new module, codenamed Stabilité. It was a compact thermal regulator for welding platforms that dramatically reduced the risk of overheating and streamlined maintenance. The design was simple, intuitive, and modular. More importantly, it solved a real problem that many small operations had learned to live with. Stabilité became Keystone's signature product. It wasn't just functional, it was memorable. Orders picked up. Distributors in Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan signed agreements. Keystone didn't explode overnight, but the momentum was undeniable. Peter kept his focus on durability, usability, and service, while June quietly scaled operations to meet demand without compromising their standards. It was at a regional trade show in Grand Rapids that Peter noticed the man in the tweed coat. He stood near the edge of the booth, hands folded behind his back, eyes on the demonstration. When the crowd thinned, he introduced himself simply. James Dalton, founder of the company that bore his name, but no longer his vision. His presence was quiet, without fanfare or entourage. He spoke softly, asked no technical questions, and left only after offering a handshake. A week later, Peter was invited to James's home. The meeting was private, deliberate. Inside the modest but well-kept house, James confessed that he had been following Keystone's rise for months. He was disappointed by what his old company had become. Driven by spreadsheets, stripped of craft, he spoke not of nostalgia, but of responsibility. He no longer recognized Dalton Engineering, and he wanted to find a way to reclaim its purpose. Peter initially declined the offer. He had spent too long rebuilding his trust in work done on his own terms, and the idea of returning to the shell of a company he once loved seemed futile. Dalton Engineering, to him, was no longer just mismanaged. It was hollowed out. He had no desire to revive what he considered already dead. But the market had other plans. Within weeks, former clients of Dalton began reaching out to Keystone. These were longtime partners who had quietly severed ties with the company after the management shift. They were not just nostalgic. They were looking for stability, for the integrity of process and quality that Peter's team now represented. The demand surged faster than Keystone could manage. Orders were backlogged, and the small crew was working at full capacity. Peter didn't want to compromise quality, but he knew that growth, if not addressed strategically, could destroy everything they had built. It wasn't just about keeping up with production. It was about maintaining standards, relationships, and the spirit of what Keystone had come to mean. James Dalton returned with a proposition. In reviewing his old contracts with the investment group that had acquired Dalton Engineering, he discovered a clause, buried but still binding, that allowed him to reclaim a portion of operational control if certain conditions of mismanagement were met. The recent safety investigations and client losses provided a legal opening. James proposed using this leverage to extract manufacturing assets and license them for use by Keystone. The idea wasn't to merge the two companies, but to form a partnership. Keystone would retain its identity and autonomy while gaining access to the infrastructure it desperately needed. Peter considered the offer carefully. He didn't want his team to become dependent on the very system they had left behind. But the deal was different. It wasn't about acquisition or surrender. It was about a strategic realignment shaped on their terms. He agreed, but with one firm condition: Harvey Langford had to resign. James didn't object. He understood that restoring any semblance of Dalton's former integrity required removing those who had steered it off course. With Harvey gone, the toxic culture he fostered would lose its anchor. The agreement was drawn up quietly. Within 2 months, the transition began. Keystone gained access to a modern production floor, trained staff who had stayed loyal to the old principles, and room to expand. In return, James saw the beginnings of his legacy restored, not through nostalgia, but through evolution. 4 months later, Keystone moved into the former Dalton Engineering facility. The building felt unfamiliar despite its history. The scent of oil and metal had been replaced by the sterile echo of neglect. In the lobby hung a glossy banner that read, "Momentum is the key to success," a remnant of the branding campaign that had replaced substance with image. Peter removed it without hesitation, folding the vinyl into a tight roll and tossing it aside. The team wasted no time. They conducted a full audit of the equipment, identifying what could be salvaged, what needed replacing, and what had been poorly modified under the previous administration. The Quality Control Department was the first to be reestablished. Old documentation was recovered, revised, and rewritten to match the precision and accountability standards Keystone had been operating under. The facility, once a symbol of rushed decisions and cost-cutting, began to breathe again under a different rhythm, deliberate and focused. Harvey Langford's departure had been formalized through a board vote. His tenure ended with a quiet severance and a closed-door statement, leaving behind a trail of lawsuits and strained vendor relationships. In his place, the board unanimously appointed Peter Mason as the new CEO. The decision reflected more than trust. It acknowledged the need for a shift in values. Danny and June were brought in as executive leads, overseeing production and finance. They introduced new HR policies that prioritize skill, loyalty, and ethical standards over age or trend-driven metrics. One of the first major initiatives was reinstating key personnel who had been laid off during the restructuring. Skilled machinists, engineers, and floor supervisors, many of whom had struggled to find work after being discarded, returned with cautious hope. Keystone also launched internship and training programs targeting experienced workers nearing retirement, ensuring that decades of technical knowledge would not be lost but passed down intentionally. Clients began returning, slowly at first. The new Dalton, under Keystone's stewardship, no longer promised the fastest delivery or the lowest cost. Instead, it offered accountability, craftsmanship, and a track record built on resilience. Over time, that proved more valuable. Keystone didn't chase growth, it earned it. By the end of the fiscal quarter, the company had recovered 2 of the major contracts Dalton had lost. More importantly, it had regained something far rarer in modern industry: trust. A year later, Peter stood on the roof of the newly renovated office building. There were no speeches, no ceremonial banners, no stage photographs. Beside him stood the same people who had once packed their belongings in silence, now watching the shop floor below, where machines once again sparked and roared with purpose. The facility pulsed with activity, but more importantly, with intention. Nothing about it was rushed. Every workstation, every safety marker, every piece of wiring had been placed with care. Peter understood in that moment that what they had reclaimed was not simply employment or a paycheck. They had restored belief in craftsmanship, in fairness, in the quiet power of experience. They had endured being dismissed and replaced by systems that valued speed over understanding, image over substance. And yet they were still here, not just present, but building something stronger. Not as a relic of a forgotten time, but as proof that values like dignity, trust, and hard-earned skill still mattered. There was no trace of the glossy slogans that had once dominated the building. Instead, there was rhythm, the clean cycle of production, the low hum of coordination, the occasional laughter echoing from the break room. Keystone was no longer just a company. It was a principle, poured into concrete and welded into steel. Peter didn't think of himself as a visionary or a leader. He never had. In his mind, he had simply refused to walk away from what was right. The foundation had always been there. He had only cleared the dust and built again, this time stronger than before.